is a sea of water that they cannot swim across. And God brought them to it. See, I think when we're facing that life is on the edge moment, that crisis moment where we realize something needs to change, we have to ask ourselves a couple questions. And the first question is this: what brought me to this crisis? As far as I'm concerned, there are three things that can bring you to your moment of crisis. Crisis option number one is that you followed God and He led you to a place of crisis. That happens sometimes. Walking with God is not easy street. It's not always just peaches and cream. It's not always wonderful. Walking with God sometimes leads you to a place of danger. Sometimes leads you to a place of confusion. Sometimes leads you to a place of crisis. Because when God brings you to those places of crisis, then He can find out what's really going on in your heart. Question number two, we'll address that in just a moment. But sometimes God brings you there. Sometimes you're there because you've walked away from God. And He was leading you to a place of prosperity and freedom. And yet you walked away and ended up in a moment of crisis. I oftentimes am counseling people who come to me and they ask me questions involving massive life decisions. You know, like this major thing is going on in their life. And they're in a very big series of turmoil situations. And whichever choice they choose is bad. And I find quite often that if you trace it backwards just a few steps, you will find a spot back here where they rejected God and said, I'm doing it on my own. What I've discovered is that if you reject God here, you might eventually reach a place where every choice is bad, where nothing will help. And sometimes you have to just go ahead and retrace your steps all the way back and say, God, I cannot do this on my own anymore. So the question to ask yourself, what brought me to this crisis? Did I follow God here? Or did I walk away from God and end up here? The third thing that might lead you to a crisis is just simply the fact that we live in a broken world. I mean, quite frankly, people around you are following God into crises, and people around you are walking away from God into crises, and some of those are going to overlap with your life. And so, sometimes the crisis you're in, you just have to acknowledge it's just the bad stuff in our world. This isn't caused by God. It isn't necessarily that God brought me to this place, and it's not because I've walked away, but even in that moment, there is something that you can do to move towards God. And that takes me to the second question that you need to ask. The second crisis question is this: will I trust God more or less? See, every crisis that you face brings you to this decision point. And the decision point says, am I going to move in the direction of God, or am I going to move in the direction of myself? Everyone. You look at the Israelites here, and they are now facing the Egyptians on one side and the sea on the other side. Who brought them to the crisis? Well, God did. And so what's the response they should have? Well, they should be moving more towards God. They should be saying, okay, God brought us here. What is it that God's going to do about this? Now, I got to set the stage for you one more time because, I mean, listen. These Israelites had just experienced 10 huge miracles while they were in Egypt. I mean, they were in Egypt and they were experiencing these miracles of God sending a plague, and then Pharaoh says, let the people go, and then God would take the plague away. And then Pharaoh would say, no, you can't go, and God would send another plague, and then God would take it away. And I was thinking just this last week, what if I were in Egypt at the time? One day, a whole lot of frogs come through my town. They're everywhere. The next day, they're gone. Would I give God credit for that? You know what I'm saying? Or would I just say, wow, what a weird coincidence. All those frogs all at once? And then, a couple days later, you got the locusts. They swarm through, but, they come, they eat, they leave. I'm like, that's weird. Frogs, locusts, that close together? What a coincidence. I'm wondering how many of those, one right after the other, would I have to have in my life before I finally say, maybe this is God? And I'm wondering if these Israelites are standing there on the shores of the Red Sea saying to themselves, do I really know if all that stuff in my past was God or just a coincidence? You see, I think a lot of times when we face crises, we ask ourselves the question, what got me here? We don't have a good answer. So then we ask the question, am I going to move towards God or away from God? And we look to our past and say, I don't have any proof that that was God back then. Maybe I really was all on my own, and so maybe I have to be all on my own right now. But friends, crisis is the moment to choose toward God. Because see, God is the one who brought these people to that place. He's the one with the power to take them through it. And so that brings us to the second part of our core principle on mastering change. The second part goes like this. Every crisis is an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity. Take a look with me at what Moses says in verse 13. Moses answers the people. They're complaining. They're like, aren't there enough graves in Egypt? Back there we could get a headstone. Out here we're just going to be swarmed and mercilessly killed. And Moses speaks up in verse 13. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. See, every crisis is an opportunity. What kind of opportunities? Well, number one, it's an opportunity to see God. Every single crisis gives us an opportunity to see, to encounter God, to meet with Him. See what Moses says? He says, God is going to fight for you. If you just get your eyes in the right place, pay attention to what God is all about, you'll recognize He brought you here. He's got something for you here. He's going to show it to you if you're watching for it. You can encounter God in the midst of your crisis. But then, let's read just a little bit further because there's something in here that makes me laugh. The Lord says to Moses in verse 15, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. It just makes me laugh. You know why? Because here they are, they're standing on the edge of the sea. And God basically says to Moses, what are you bothering me for? Don't you already know? Just walk across the sea. It's like, go there,